and try and study it using my own limited knowledge of how to draw, telling you what little things I learned on the way to replicate these styles. Of course, splash art from League is actually the work of teams of artists that go through various stages, and the style isn't due to one person like some other games. But I found it interesting how despite so many people working on these designs, they typically look cohesive and in one general style. I'm going to go over all that I learned from studying and challenging myself to replicate this style in my own workflow, to draw this character from Arknights in a semi-realistic style. Or I would have done that if everything didn't go so wrong. This isn't a video of how I successfully drew League-like splash art. This is how I failed to make splash art many times. But eventually I stumbled on a workable system to draw a semi-realistic character. I started off with a sketch based on the compositions I liked most in League splash art. Most of the body is seen to show off the character, and there's usually a sense of depth in these, with something, hands, weapons, objects looking like they're popping out of the screen with some foreshortening, and a blurred background. The character I'm drawing, Penance, has a cool hammer chain flail weapon, so I plan to have it hit someone and have that be the foreground element to pop out of the screen. But it also made a really weird composition. On the left half, the scale had some good foreshortening and overlap with the body, but on the right, like, what is this? It looks too divided from the main bulk of the image. Of course, I fixed all of this later, but that's getting ahead of myself. I also plan to follow the lighting in League's splash art. A lot of the light sources are strong, with either a backlight or a front light to emphasize the 3D forms of the face. I chose to do a backlight, much like the reference image, but this was my first mistake, and my first failed attempt at a face. It's always easier to draw portraits with harsh shadows because it decreases the guesswork you need to do when painting the planes. But because there was already a hard light coming from the back, I'm forced to use very mellow shadows to paint the face, basically upping the difficulty a bunch. It also didn't help that I went in blind without a reference to wing it like I usually do, which is a bad idea since I haven't drawn realistic faces in a while. You can see my over-reliance on lines to separate the nose from the rest of the face, which is contrary to the semi-realism style as a whole. In real life, do you see lines between different objects? No. Value and color is what separates things, so when you paint realistically, you can't rely on line work to separate objects like in some other styles. These values I'm using here are too close together, making the face look flat. And you can see my struggle with the lips. So let's try again, this time making an outline of what I need to paint and the shadows that go there. Then I painted the actual parts underneath and erased the line art layer afterwards. Good enough. And I'll even do the same for everything else with the hair and clothes. Every overlapping thing is given its own layer, which is good for when I want to make changes afterwards, or move it around, or liquefy. I'm pretty proud of the clothing here because I was really aware that I needed to use values to separate each fold or piece. For the cloth, a lot of what I did was section off the area I wanted to paint with the selection tool and use the soft brush to make a gradient and a value difference between the folds. Even though there's no line here, this value difference kind of makes it look like there is, which is what I want. I was lucky with this character because since her clothing was already black and white, I didn't have to worry about the color too much, occasionally shifting the hue on the hue ring from side to side. At this point, what I'm really proud of was the gold buttons and accessories. For example, this gold thing here. I just used a soft brush to place some browns and desaturated yellows for the base, and then went in with a bright yellow for the highlights and to again make the planes of the accessory, just like in these splash arts here. And here comes eyes that stare into your soul. I took a look at the splash art again and I realized that these eyes don't even look half realistic. Look, where are the creases, the form, the pupils like in the actual splash art? So I tried futilely to put them on, and the lips are way too small. So let's try, nope, that looks horrible. Let's just give up and, ooh, a shiny chain that reaches out of the frame. But wait, isn't this composition even worse since it's covering the arm? And these buildings are way too saturated and stealing a lot of the attention even though they're simplified. On to attempt 4 of polishing a piece of shit. At this point, this is around 12 hours of drawing by the way, so I'm pretty attached trying to make this work. but sometimes you just need to let go of things you spend a lot of time on and restart. And that's what I did. I kept most of the body, but the face, horrible chain composition, and background just has to go. Meanwhile, I was trying to think of what kind of expression I was going to make her have. The previous stances were supposed to be powerful, she was lifting her weapon, but now without it in her stance, it's kind of neutral. Where should her face point? Left or right? I decided to make her have a melancholy, unsure kind of face to match her passive stance. And I desaturated the colors to kind of make it blue tinted and sad. What if there are storm clouds and it's raining like in the story?
To be about my daily art studies. We're gonna cover the routine and practices that I generally do that allows me to draw fairly decently within a year of practice. And this is not a secret. Most of these are already out there, so I'm just sharing how I structure my studies based on what I gathered from professionals I stumble across the internet. Now of course it depends on what you're trying to accomplish, but here we're gonna centralize our study to my art, which usually involves characters. So here I came up with 3 study categories. Each of those studies have their own difficulty and time frame, and longer study time doesn't always equal more improvement. It is important to have a consistent hour of quality study rather than studying the whole day. I mean, it could probably work, but consistent study is definitely more effective, so make sure to do it every day. But take breaks once in a while so you don't burn out. Human reference studies. This category covers 50% of my studies. I always say this, but copying is the most effective way to learn how to draw. Anything goes as long as you're drawing real-life humans, but we can get specific with our studies. If you're interested in drawing like this stuff, then you should absolutely learn anatomy. Here's a quick guide that I use to learn anatomy. We're not gonna go on full details here since I've already made a couple of videos about it, so here's a short version. So first is shapes, then skeleton structure, and finally, proportions and muscle anatomy. I'm still focusing on maximizing my skills to draw humans, or at least get decent, so most of my studies comprise of anatomy drawings. This video is brought to you by Universe. If you're looking to showcase your work, here's the routine that I follow. So first is anatomy study. Let's say it's day 1. This day, I want to start studying how arms and torso works. And here's an example of what my reference board looks like. I just copy a set of anatomy parts that I feel like doing that day. I mostly do breakdowns and analyze the reference topic. It's mostly just me trying to figure out which shape represents the anatomy best. It usually takes me around 5 to 20 minutes to sketch a single decent output, and I would spend no more than 1 to 2 hours studying a subject because I tend to forget stuff that I study. So I prioritize short and concise study, and I think 1 to 2 hours is a bit long, but you can always go further than that if you have time. Also, I think before going to bed is the best time to learn stuff, because I heard about some scientific fact where you can retain most of what you learn before going to sleep. So maybe it's giving your brain time to process that information while you sleep. And I think it works because I also tried this when studying academically. Now, if you have trouble finding time to draw, it's easier if you have a pen and paper always in reach of your hand, like in your desk or bag. Always carry one, because the problem is probably not that you're tired or busy, it's probably because you're intimidated or overwhelmed with drawing, and you always have this expectation of drawing like the artists you watch on TikTok that has worked 10,000 hours honing their craft, and you feel like you can draw like them easy. But once you fell short of your own expectation, you are left disappointed and unmotivated. And honestly, that was just my experience. But if you also have this experience, then here's how I fixed it. First tip is just draw what you like, and if it doesn't work, well, that's probably because of your lack of skill and knowledge. So you just have to study and practice. And to do that, we just have to start drawing. Don't even think about what you're gonna draw, but instead, think about something simple, like drawing a square, circle, cube, or even just a line. Because it is important that you touch that pen and draw something on a paper. It's actually harder to start drawing than to keep drawing. So you have to make it easier for yourself by making drawing convenient. The trick to consistency is once you manage to draw for a month, it will be less like a chore and more of a habit, since it's become like brushing your teeth. And speaking of that, when you brush your teeth, you have this mindset that it's gonna keep you healthy and clean. You can also keep that mindset when you're drawing. You have to realize that every practice you do, you're essentially improving, even if you don't feel like it. For day 2, I'm moving on with the head. Here's my usual approach when studying something. First, I divide my work into bite-sized information. You don't just draw the face, you also need to have methods that will make it easier. like the Loomis head method. Then we'll study the anatomy of the head, which is comprised of the skeleton structure, muscle, facial features, portions, and then style/design. Now, I left style and design for last because you have to learn all of those fundamentals I mentioned first before you start going in with the style and design. When I was a beginner, drawing the head was the first thing I learned, because it's the most interesting and eye-catching subject in art. And it's different to what I'm doing now, because back then, it was mostly traditional pencil portraits, because I noticed it easily impresses people when you can draw faces. So I continued to draw faces, but I thought it was easy, since all I'm doing is copy a face. I slowly gravitated into anime art. I actually liked anime first, that's why I even start drawing. But like I said, realistic faces catches more attention. But I grew out of it, so I started drawing anime. At first I was copying them, but I didn't just want to copy anime. I wanted to make my own. Do my own characters, poses, design, composition, expression, and style, so that one day I can make my own comic or even animation. But I didn't have any idea on how to improve that. So I just started what self-taught artists would do. Go on YouTube. I soon learned that to draw from imagination, I had to not draw from imagination. So yeah, you actually have to learn from scratch and study fundamentals and combine that with copying and learning from real life. So I was actually on the right track, since I was already copying faces. So I continued learning from real life, but this time I had a purpose. That's when I started getting into the fundamentals. And now I'm currently still mastering anatomy, which I enjoy very much. Once you finish studying the head part, we're now gonna move on to the other parts. It's also important that you learn how to schedule your practice. For example, you can study the head part for a week and then move down to the body. Even if you still don't know how to draw the head, it's gonna be easier if you just do value studies. Value studies is not limited on human subject. It could be anything as long as it has proper shadows. The art could be realistic or even semi-realistic. Value studies is where you're gonna focus on grayscale studies, and it doesn't really matter if you're going for a non-realistic art style. Knowing basic lighting can literally change your mind, and knowing more is always better than knowing less. We're gonna need a bunch of black and white reference because it's convenient. Plus, having a colored reference would mean more work and processing, since you now have to think about color theory, which is a whole lot of problem on its own. So with black and white references, you'll only have to worry about what's in light and what's in shadow. It's a great way to have a division for your lighting. Okay, let's have this study, and we'll use this reference right here. We're only gonna use two values, one for the shadow and one for the light. See how well we can work out a drawing just by painting the shadow part. After that, let's add the local values, or the design colors of the character. And from there we can add some midtones and blend some edges. This is the part where you need to have a careful observation from the reference. The hard part starts here. This is where you train your eyes to see shadows and values, and combine that with proper decision making. And to help you with your decision making, you're gonna base it off this ball of value. This can help you identify which values you are looking at. Now, it's not gonna be easy, but you'll probably get the hang of it within a year. What I'm doing here is mostly just copying what I see from the reference. Having a deeper understanding of how light works can definitely help you, but right now, I'm copying it raw. Most of the time, I turn my brain off doing this phase because thinking too much doesn't really help. I usually just rely more on my experience and instincts when copying references. Because when you're studying something long enough, that knowledge becomes like your instincts. But of course, it's gonna be different if you're gonna draw from imagination. That's where you really have to be analytical and really think about it. If you want to try out different practice, you can break down a bunch of paintings, or you can learn from grayscale tutorials made by professional artists. You can find them for free here on YouTube, and I would highly suggest learning from Marco Bucci. He's a great teacher and artist, and I really learned a lot from his videos. Now, there are a couple of ways to apply effective shadow, and they all depend on methods. For example,
Day 1. Moving on to day 2. It's time to actually learn to draw the head. What I teach in my art program is an adapted version of the Loomis method, so I'll show you the quick version here. To learn proportions, it's easier to draw a face from the front, so let's do that here. Every head will start with a circle, or a sphere I should say. We'll cut the diameter in 3 equal parts and slide that line down until it overlaps the edge of the circle. That's how you'll find the length of the jaw. From there, we can draw a rounded V shape to get the outline of the head. The eyebrows conveniently line up with the line we drew, the nose as well, and the mouth is just halfway between the nose and the chin line. The eyes, of course, go right below the eyebrows, and the ears will also use the same guidelines and fit between the eyebrows and the nose lines. We can add a neck, and that's the quick version. And don't worry about the facial features just yet. Just practice this until you've memorized kind of those proportions, or at a minimum like 3 to 6 attempts. And I'll add an optional double bonus here if you have the time. The more repetitions, the better. And before we move on to day 3, I have a class that I'll link down below that goes over the head construction in a bit more details. Or if this is going way too fast and you're looking for a proper long and you should be at day 3. Hopefully by now, the head construction is less of a mystery and you should be able to get a lot more out of copying other artists that you like, which is exactly what you'll be doing. So find some references from an artist that you like and copy the head only, without fully drawing the facial features from 3 different angles: front, profile, and 3/4 angle. It's best if your 3 references are all from the same artist. Basically, what you would hope to be able to do yourself eventually. An artist whose style you like, obviously. For the face, you can just leave quick indications of where all the facial features are going to go, but keep your appetite for the next day. The focus is on the head shape only today. Once again, you can do double that for best results. And it's important to say that when it comes to the style of the artist that you're using as reference, it's entirely possible the proportions they chose won't match exactly what we learned from the Loomis method on day 2, and that's okay. I would compare the 2 and note the main differences, how the style deviates from the ideal head, or the realistic head drawn using the Loomis method, and why you might prefer that better. Maybe the eyes are larger, stronger features, blockier shapes, whatever it is. When you understand those differences and what they're built on, it's way easier to replicate. Now it's day 4 and we'll be continuing from where we left off on day 3. Grab the same faceless heads that you drew, and this time we'll be adding the facial features. Once again, using those same references you used on day 3. Hopefully you've been thinking about it since yesterday. You've felt a bit weird maybe to have a head drawing unfinished without a face. So what you'll be observing today should stick a lot more as a result. So do observe how the artist simplifies the eyes, the eyebrows, the nose, the mouth, and while you're at it, maybe look up a few other artists that you like to compare how they draw those same features. Also compare with real photos, real people. How is the drawing version different? And if drawing the whole face at once is hard, just practice drawing a few eyes by themselves using your references first, a few noses, etc. and then move on to adding them to the head drawings that you have. I have another popular class that might help you draw stylized facial features, so I'll link that down below if you want to check that out later too. And then for day 5, and we're almost done, it's practice set day. This time you'll be redrawing the head along with its facial features, just like you did on day 3 and 4, but try doing it from memory this time, relying on the proportions that you know from the Loomis method
In the previous video, we have guided you through drawing the head and face. One of the biggest mistakes when starting to draw is draw the head first, as it often misaligns the face axis, making it hard to visualize the character. So the first thing we need is the face head angle. You can watch a video about the head drawing method we did before. We need to choose the face head angle, then determine the basic facial proportions. The face can be divided into 3 approximately equal parts: forehead to eyebrow, eyebrow to nose, and nose to chin. Through that, we can determine the hairline located in this red line. Now divide the head into 3 areas: front, side, back. Add hair to get front backs, hair on both sides, hair in the back. To determine hair direction, first have the basic idea of the character hairstyles. Is the hair short or long, loose or styled, curly or straight? Is the character hair still or moving in the wind? For example, I will give a character short, naturally loose hair with bangs in the front. Start by simply sketching the overall shape of the hair according to your imagination. Next, determine the hair root. The root can be located in many places depending on the hairstyle you choose. But with loose hair, the root will usually be in this area. From this point, draw the hair parting line. The hair will grow from this parting line and follow the direction to the end point of the hair shape you determined earlier. You can show this by drawing arrows along from head and surround the draw head shape. So you have the direction of the hair curves. To draw effectively, we must always remember the rule of going from general to specific, from simple to complex to ensure the overall harmony. Now here's the 30-second ad break. Our studio currently offers a beginner sketching course that prioritizes. Hair sometimes looks quite complicated, so we should reduce it to a simple shape according to minimalist thinking. From there, separate it into smaller curves. From the direction of the curves that have been determined, we will draw more details using ribbon method. Imagine each curve as a soft ribbon. Each ribbon is essentially formed with a long rectangle strip structure. Depending on the characteristic of the character, we will bend it into the hairstyle we want. This method is suitable for both straight and curly hair. Straight hair will be looser with less curl, while curly hair has a larger bending amplitude, creating more waves. The curlier the hair, the more curved the ribbon will be. You need to pay attention to keep the ribbon soft with a natural changing thickness, and finish by adding a few small hairlines separating from the main curve to create naturalness. When styling the character, hairstyle plays an important role in expressing their personality and life context. For example, short hair expresses dynamism, practicality, or modernity. Long hair expresses femininity, tradition, or power. Curly hair suggests freedom, creativity, and strong personality. Elaborate hair, meticulous, delicate, suitable for noble or lavish characters. Simple hair, casual, friendly, or busy, not focusing on appearance. Hair accessories, bells, clips, or crowns express status, personality, and life period. Context, hairstyles and accessories help define the time and area of the character, from classic to modern. One of the best ways to practice drawing hair is to draw from the reference model. When you first start with available pictures, then improve by drawing from the real photos and simplify the hair shape. You can use internet photos, 3D models, or take your old photos. Instead of completing a complex hairstyle from the start, focus on a small part of the hair. For example, draw straight hair from different angles and basic hair shapes: short, long, thin, thick. Understand the hair form on big type. Hair has countless styles, so practice drawing strands of hair in your desired styles, like wavy or curl, etc. To understand the structure of the hairstyle you want to draw first will be easier for you.
When you search for information or references about face head on the internet, you'll find many methods to apply, such as Loomis, paper, triangle, box, Rayleigh, and so many method. But in this video, I will show you a super easy combined
common question I get asked is, should I study the skull and how should I study it? So I recommend having a skull. I like having one to look at. I think the Proco skull is awesome. You can try doing it from Invention, but again, I would say the reference I would recommend is that you have a skull to look at. And see if you can integrate it into the study or a study of your head construction. So like, let's say we're gonna do one where we tilt our head up or a skull up. We don't have to do the neck and all of that for this one, but let's just see if we can incorporate as a understructure, as a way to kind of be generous to our study of this complex form, which is the skull. Maybe we use our setup steps, so our gesture steps, to get the shape of the skull. We think about using that brow as the area for which we'll tilt our perspectives up or down. And then from here, let's start to think about the interior parts. Like, and even at the beginning, you could use this as a tool to think about some of the differences in terms of how you approach the drawing. Like, I began here with a ball, but the skull isn't a ball. So instead, maybe I start to think about, at an early stage, the idea that, well, there's a forehead that looks more like this, and instead of the ball, I'm going to try to create maybe more of an egg. Now, the ball is a great way to summarize the shape and get it down on the page and working. But if I really strip it back and start to look at just the skull, I think I would see something more like this, or I do see something more like this. The key to doing an exercise or building an awareness of the skull, I would say, is treating it as still simplified forms or manageable forms, not getting lost in the nooks and crannies and the details and the cracking, but still try to work down the face in an organized way that just brings or allows for a little bit more attention to the way that you would normally think the construction. I think the purpose is that you want the skull to inform your head construction. You don't always want to have to draw an entire skull every time that you want to make a face. You want to take from this language or from this form and digest that information back into your process. So let's do our center line here. That gives me my symmetry. Let's just do our basic proportions. So half between the brow and the chin is the nose. Half between the nose and the brow is the sockets, bottom. Half again might be the keystone, center of the eye. Maybe we could do some thirds down here for the chin. First third is the separation of the teeth. Second third is the top of the chin. And then that would be the bottom of the chin. In my head construction, I always look for the side plane. So that would come as a result of finding that temple, finding the hairline, and maybe I could see that a little bit better in terms of the skull, where does that break? Right, so I've seen this plane, and then that has that change here to go up. So what might have been abstract in the head construction, and now with a little bit of study, you can get a bit more of a concrete feel for what it is that you're simplifying when you go through these steps. Here's that change. So I can really see from the top of the skull, with that hairline drawn back or related back, that there is this flatter surface. And that does pretty much end right behind that temple. So now that could be my cutting back some of this egg form that I've started with. Here's this extra kind of interesting detail at the bottom that some head constructions don't always exaggerate or call attention to. Mine doesn't always. This is that mastoid process. I kind of like to design it like a little upside down shark fin. That would be where the sternomastoid would connect or find its home there, your neck muscle. And then what also interests me is right above this, I could see the auditory area. So sometimes in my head constructions, I lay in a little figure 8, or a couple spheres to show the placement of the ear and the placement of the jaw. So that's just kind of thinking about those two forms, looking at their proximity or how I see them relative to that back point of the skull. Let's do our jaw shape. Now I'm seeing this would be that back portion to my jaw. The nice part is I have all of this as an envelope to try to, so I'm not just working line to line or part to part in terms of my investigation of this form. But I do like to get these big parts set up around the outside. So here's the chin, or the change for the chin. And now I'd probably see a little bit underneath that. Now let's jump back up here and kind of work through our cheekbone. So the normal way I might approach this in terms of just trying to appreciate it would be resting a pair of glasses. And so my glasses aim for this line of the bottom of the socket. Then I'll drop that down and decide on a height, and then bring this back. Sometimes you could think of this, or sometimes I'll think of this as resting on top of the figure 8 there, that sideways 8, I guess. So now, but maybe I feel like, well, I always am so abstract with that. Like, how do I really interpret what this bone is? Well, it seems to have, there's more of a sweep. So I'm always an advocate for the idea that curves are best built from a series of straights. So if I can get a couple straight lines that help me get the big feel for that direction in that bone, then I could come back in and kind of add that nice S-curve, right, that ends that bone towards the back. Maybe that helps me study and think about that, and then maybe I'll try to think more about the depth. Like, what is the perspective? Does this have a thickness to it? But the approach is always, what is the pattern or the big shape? Do I modify it to have a bit more of a curve? And then I like to think about what is the perspective. And then once I feel like I have some kind of understanding, then I start to develop the surface form, the perspective form. The transition of this into the temple is a really crazy and unique area. Right, so I'm thinking about the temple. Maybe we'll just do it again. Let's start as a straight. That could be the placement of the temple. Right? It's just the problem with the skull is it's so seductive to just start to find yourself in all of these little curves and these small crevices and these really beautiful winding bones. What does this temple do? Well, that now it starts to kind of bend into the top of the forehead. So I'm just going to curve it right into this area at the brow line. And then let's also let's finish off what we started just in this investigation of the cheekbone. So the cheek kind of has this great curve forward. I usually leave this out in my head constructions because what I like to set up around this area is the idea that this is a side and that this is a front, right? So to have a curve that kind of extends past there breaks my box or breaks my basic front plane, side plane, or the way that I would appreciate that in a big head construction. So normally I would think of that same design there as like, here's that glasses, this is the frame, this is the lens, and that has that really abrupt turn. So you could see or appreciate now how reductive that is, right? Because this is way more organic, but I could also now start to maybe add that, right? So think about that glasses shape turning in. It's of course, it's more curved, but here I'm just going to bring it across. I always continue to kind of be fascinated by the idea that the bottom of the socket comes from your cheek. It's just bizarre. So now we're across the brow. Let's set up some areas here of like big ideas. Now you can see how easily I got pulled into really working through the small issues of that cheekbone and forgetting my own rule. I also see in the skull there's this superciliary arch, which feels like it's a little cashew kind of bent and plugged into the side of that keystone. That's a weird little bump. So we'll design that and maybe even think about that architecture, that surface. Here's that glabella. So that would maybe pull back here. And then let's look at the socket. So socket is kind of rounded and then straighter on this area of the temple. But then we also get this spiraling. So I could feel like that plane where I would want to connect my eye. Corner of my eye is in here, but I can also see with the use of cast shadow how deep and how much that recesses back in. So in my head construction or in the course, I talk about the eye living inside of kind of a cone, right? That's the eye socket as it pulls back, right? So we're thinking about all of that surface back in there that the eye would cover. My other way of interpreting this would be thinking of the sockets across the face as 3 planes. And does that seem to match? Sometimes the investigation of skull could be just you testing your preconceived ideas of what and how you draw it. I go through periods where I draw the skull a lot and then when I don't. And sometimes when I don't, I regret that I don't more often. So on this side, I'm gonna drop that side of the socket down. And then I think at this side, it's always hard, this side. So what I think is especially difficult maybe in this view is like, how does that cheekbone show up over here? Like how would I draw what's happening on this side over here on that side? Maybe I'll just do more of a copy and really just try to study, not make this something it doesn't have to be. Maybe that's enough for this, just to get the idea that that's moving behind and then this drops down. Let's pick up with the nasal saddle. This would be a way for me to maybe test if I'm always putting this at the right height. So here's the attachment into that keystone. Here's the spine as it starts to move down. Here's the peak and then how the housing of that nasal aperture drops. Now, what is the shape of that? Kind of like an upside down heart. And then here it peaks up, you get the shape, and then curious about how would I explore like a simple way to show the space inside of this? How would I extend that spine back, or maybe show this part? Right, so that becomes the housing. And what about these planes? So this seems to drop down in this way, and then we really get a strong influence from the cheek still. One thing I see with the cheek or kind of notice is this square that I've been referring to as the glasses. If I cut that at a diagonal from corner to corner, maybe that'd be a way to kind of keep this curve, but also show that the cheekbone itself here starts to recess a bit. So that pulls back, and maybe I could design that over here. That might be a nice takeaway, that I could split that square into a diagonal at some point. And that might be a nice way to make my head construction feel a little bit more reflective of the skull itself. Another thing I notice is maybe about in the middle of that square, that's where it looks like this cheek curves and becomes the canine. That's a useful observation, maybe from the standpoint of rhythm. Maybe I could pull that down to maybe that's where the plane of the teeth change. And maybe I could use that over here too. So you can see how it's half analytical and then half, you're kind of testing theories almost. Well, I think I might be able to do this or learn this. It's just in opposition to like, here's the mouth, here's the tooth, right? So you can see how the whole energy changes. Instead of maybe some kind of intellectual discovery and investigation, you're now shifted, and maybe your thinking becomes more passive. The emphasis is put more on just the direct translation of what you see into, your paper. So teeth are always weird. How do we know how much to add or how little? Right? Or maybe we could just design some shapes but not draw all of them. So we'd have our incisors and then the canine, but maybe instead I'll just kind of map the way they turn instead of drawing them all. And then what I think is really interesting is how they change direction. And so I'm really able to now think about the structure of the bite. And the bite's coming from up here. That's pretty wild. So I'll just take this curve and maybe move it back. And then this could be a way where I would think about the back of our bite. So molars and premolars would be back here. Let's just hatch that in, because I don't think I'd ever use this. Maybe if the mouth was open, or there's somebody biting or yelling or something like that. Let's just judge or think about the height of the teeth. That's pretty interesting. How tall are they? And then let's get the back of the jaw. So how close is the back of the jaw to the teeth? It's pretty close. I'm going to try to draw it as like a thin box. And so that starts to curve in. So I want to think of this as having a depth and a width or a cross. And then it's got a little gap in the middle. That's pretty cool. So this point, so that push of the bone up, or that from my view would be going slightly behind or under the cheekbone, that would be grabbing, or it would be grabbed by the temporalis muscle. So you'd have the big muscle on the side of your head comes down and grabs that point. You can see this much larger in different animals' skulls. So that'd be a nice thing to do next even, is maybe grab an animal skull. Not that they're readily available like at the supermarket, but you can find pictures online and see if you could treat it the same way, and then start comparing these. What's the difference between, like the shape of the cheek in a human and the cheek shape in, a lion or a gorilla? And then how would I draw the lower portion of the mouth? Well, all I mostly did here was just adjust my center line. So I want to get the idea that the mouth comes out and back. But one thing I notice is the lower teeth are a little smaller. That makes sense, because we have to be able to close our mouths. Right? So not that that's going to really impact much. I'm not gonna draw all the teeth. But for me, it's enough just to kind of see across and develop that form. I like that idea where we found that kind of cut moment or that plane change moment. Maybe this can go back and up that way. And I think it's interesting that the teeth on the bottom come from your jaw. I think I'm just teeth averse. I hate the dentist. I hate going to the dentist. I don't particularly like teeth.
Let's see what the damage is, shall we?
And then we have the mandible that would be a little bit more of like a really mild box, but this would all be a bone. Right? So this is interesting that the teeth kind of sit into and on top of that form. Here's that point I was communicating in the course about the difference between male and female being wider or different angled. On this side, how would I show that same jaw over here? So I'm always asking questions when I'm drawing. Sometimes those questions are productive, sometimes they're critical, sometimes they're any number of things. The thing for the skull would be just anything to avoid getting lost in just an act of copying. So maybe that's our denture sphere. I think my jaw's a little beefy. So now I'm noticing that this guy's got a little beefy jaw. So let's bring that up some. Let's bring that chin. I think the form of the chin's pretty interesting. It's smoother than I kind of remember drawing. It's kind of a nice flow from the bottom of the mouth into the kind of the curve and turn of this chin back. And so let's move this up. You know, it's not supposed to be precious. I'm just trying to make a study so that I can take something away and be better the next time, or test theories or ideas that I have about the head construction and see how I might be able to broaden or to advance them. But that's about where I'd end it, right? I don't think that there's much worth kind of going into anything further unless, you know, you could see how it quickly will devolve at this point for me into hatching, which is fine, but it's just another way of exploring surface and form. So hopefully that helps. So go grab a Proko skull and have fun trying to abstract your head construction and pick up on the big features of the skull as you draw.
The skull is made up of 22 different bones. Inferior brain shape is found on each side of your head. Is also the internal later video. A pair of nasal bones, a pair of nasal conchae, a pair of zygomatic maxillae are fused, comprise the hard palate.
That's from anterior all the way from this coronal suture. So everything in front of this coronal suture is going to be your entire frontal bone. So again, this here is the frontal.
In the previous video, we have guided you through drawing the head and face. Today we will cover an essential part of character drawing, hair. Like the face, hair is one of the parts